Hello, listeners. Welcome to BornCurious, coming to you from Harvard Radcliffe Institute. I'm Heather Min.
And I'm Ivelisse Estrada. On this podcast, we often talk to creative minds about their passions and what sparked them.
In our last episode, we spoke with Beronda L. Montgomery about her latest book, When Trees Testify, which came out this month.
Beronda is a plant scientist, and her fascination with that particular kingdom is so infectious that for this episode, we thought we'd continue our conversation with her.
We're so eager to learn all the things from you today.
And I'm eager to tell them.
So to start us off,
Yes.
what is a plant scientist? What does one do as a plant scientist? What did you do as a plant scientist?
Yeah, so I think, as I started to think of myself as a real plant scientist, I just thought of myself as one very curious about plants. So being very interested in plants from, the very DNA of plants all the way to plants as individuals and plants being in community. So I think in large part, plant scientists are interested in how plants are aware of where they are and then how they go about growing and thriving, dealing with all kinds of things around them. Yeah.
What about, were you always a fan of plants throughout your life?
No, much to my mom's chagrin. So my mom has a beautiful green thumb, and I grew up in a house with like hundreds of house plants, and our yard was always the star of the neighborhood, sometimes even getting like the neighborhood little award. So my mom and dad were deeply into plants, and none of us kids really took to them, largely because our chore was to water them. Our chore was to look for yellow leaves. And so I wasn't as fascinated with them at that time. And it really took me a while to come back to them. Even though in probably both of my books, I talk about how I spent so much time outside in nature and was surrounded by plants, but I wasn't really what I would call interested in plants. I don't think any of my mom's kids were. And now she's very fascinated that I am where I am. Yeah.
So she's pleased with
She's
her.
very
Would you
pleased,
transfer
very
me?
pleased, yes.
Do you live in, are there a lot of plants in your home?
So there was. So I was in Michigan for almost 18 years on the faculty of Michigan State University. And I had really cultivated beautiful indoor and outdoor gardens. And then when I moved from Michigan in 2022, I went through a whole year of mourning my garden in Michigan before I could even break soil in my new place in Iowa. And then I started gardening there a little bit. And just before coming here, I, gifted and transferred a lot of houseplants to other people to take care of. So it takes me a while, but everywhere I go, I start up slowly.
Yeah.
So what is this lifelong relationship with plants that are indoors and outdoors? What does that entail?
I love that question because when I was in Michigan, I spent a lot of time doing work with some youth in Detroit who lived in the city, didn't have like real yards, but we did a lot of container gardening. And so I think there's this sense that when you're in the city, you don't have space. You can do a lot of container garden. But the other beautiful thing about plants, I had a lot of conversations with people about this during the pandemic, is that, plants are very forgiving. If you grow a plant and then you have to move, you put it in the compost, right? They easily go through the cycle of life in ways that you can't with other, things you might have in your home, fish or, other kinds of pets. So I think that this kind of sense that I don't know if I can have them because I move a lot or I'm in the city, there's still a beautiful way to have a plant for a little while. And either return it to the light cycle of life through composting or give it to someone else. Or for people who try and they don't have the green thumb that my mom has, it's very forgiving if you do your best and it still doesn't work. Just return it to the soil and it will compost and help something else grow.
Wow. So what are the kinds of questions that plant biologists ask? What don't we already know about plants and trees and shrubs?
I love that question. And I'm smiling because I remember my son, Nicholas, who's now 23, when he was in second or third grade, they were doing a module on photosynthesis, which is one of the things I study, right? Which is really a very simple process that plants take carbon dioxide and water, and through a series of complicated reactions, they turn it into sugar, but it's a pretty simple process. And at the end of the module, the teacher said that this is one part of science that we fully understand. And my son threw his hand up in the air and said, no, I have to tell you that that's not right, Miss Faricello. And she says, why? He said, because I hear about photosynthesis over and over and over at the dinner table. So I think that there are lots of things I share that because I think there are lots of things that we do think we understand about plants, and yet we don't understand it fully enough that there aren't still questions to ask. So we understand photosynthesis to a large degree, but we don't understand how less than 20% of the sun that hits the earth actually gets successfully translated into a product by plants. And I think that whatever area you're studying in science, there's still that kind of capacity that sometimes you understand a general idea, but there's still all the nuances of it that we're still trying to understand. And plants are still evolving. So sometimes we think we understand something, and over time it changes because of changes in our ecosystem, or just because of evolutionary processes. And I always say that's wonderful because I'm not ready to retire, which means that there are still questions that are out there to pursue, to try to understand.
Can you give a specific example of how plants are evolving?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there are lots of places where plants evolve very slowly, but there are places on the earth where we can see it kind of in the life cycle of a scientist. So there are some hot spots, like in the Galapagos Islands, where you see over time the shapes of flowers changing. There was a very interesting story about the co-evolution of plants and insects. And so the colors of some insects have been changing because of changes in trees. And sometimes this is because climate change is changing what grows in a particular area. So there are some trees that are less densely populated than they used to be because of climate change, which means their bark color has slightly changed. And if you look at some moths, they have then changed. And so it's those kinds of things that it's hard sometimes to see in the life of a scientist, but we often have either long-term studies or these hot spots like the Galapagos where you can go and see these things happen in time.
So you're saying that the evolution is happening more quickly in the Galapagos?
In some cases, it's happening more quickly, and some of that is because there are lots of short-lived plants, right? And so I think, when you think about finches, birds, and there have been places where people have studied them because you see these changes in them happening very rapidly.
So you wrote a book.
I wrote a book.
I wrote 2 books.
Or 2.
But let's
Yeah.
But your first book, Lessons, or your first trade book,
Yeah.
Lessons from Plants. And in that book, you talked about plant behavior.
Yes.
And I think that many people probably wouldn't think of plants as having behavior.
They
Yes.
just sit there, don't they?
Well, a lot of people think about plants as being behaved upon, as opposed to having behavior. And it's interesting with you saying they just sit there. That's what actually drove me to really focus in on plants. So once I decided I really wanted to be a biology professor, I was exploring different areas, doing some ecology work with snakes, studying mice and all of that. And then I took a plant physiology class basically because it fit my schedule. I had really thought about plants as just sitting there. And then I got in this class, and I'd like to give a lot of credit to the professor, Professor John Chewinski, because he was so enthusiastic about plants that I realized they weren't just sitting there. It's just that their behaviors and their actions are slower than we often stop to look at. And we don't notice it until it's something really abrupt, like changing leaf color, or when our plant bends towards the window. But they're behaving all the time. We just aren't paying attention to their behaviors.
Could you give us some examples about the plants that respond to their environment and interact and engage with the life around them, even though they stay put?
I think most plants do so. I love to talk about examples that some of us may have encountered. So one of my favorite plants is still mimosa, which I first encountered in kindergarten when my teacher brought one in.
I only know mimosa as the orange juice and the...
I like all mimosas. There's no judgment of any kind of mimosas. I'm in with all the mimosas. But mimosa is one that a lot of teachers bring into the classroom. Some people will say it looks like a fern just because the leaf has those mini leaflets. But this is one that if you touch it, the fronds, they will close up. And so teachers love to bring this into the classroom to help students sense very early that plants aren't just sitting there. And after some time, it'll slowly open back up. The beautiful thing about it is that you can see how plants can learn if learning is responding to behavior over time. Whereas if you touch the mimosa several times, it will soon realize that this isn't a an insect, that this is a repeated action and it'll stop closing, right? And so there's this sense that that touch is no longer something I need to spend energy responding to. So I love that one. Other plants that often come into the classroom are ones like Venus flytrap, which are the ones that digest insects to get nitrogen. And it's the same thing, the insect goes in and it closes up. So those are ones that make it very visible. And when you talked about this slow motion, you see that other plants have these kinds of actions. So a lot of plants will nutate, where they kind of rotate around this axis. You can't really see it, but if you tape it over time, you can. But I love the ones that allow us to see it immediately, and then to imagine that similar types of behaviors are happening with plants, just slower than we have time to sit there and look for usually. You asked earlier, Heather, about what it means to be a plant scientist. And I think that being a plant scientist is learning about plants. And because of the way I was raised, where we had this principle of reciprocity, I wanted to start asking, what was I learning from plants? So that's kind of where the lessons from plants came from in the most gracious sense. It second came from my sitting in faculty meetings and getting frustrated, right, with the group of plant scientists not using the knowledge we knew about plants. And so I would start saying we would never do that if we were working with a plant. So it was this kind of dual frustration as well as a responsibility to ask not only what am I doing as a plant scientist in terms of learning about plants, but now what do I do with that knowledge? And the lessons from plants became a way to give back, to think about sharing that knowledge in a lot of different ways.
So can you give us a little primer on what these lessons that plants have to teach us are? What do plant behaviors have to teach us?
As aren't humans the center of the universe? Aren't we the more intelligent being?
We love to think so. But I love to say that in so many ways, I think plants are more clever than us. And one of the lessons that I like to share that demonstrates that are how plants compete. So frequently, humans, we have to compete to the death, right? We're not happy until I have destroyed you, or merely, there's some sense that I am the true victor. When you look at what happens in nature, most times, there's always an exception, but many times plants will compete just to get enough of what they need, and then they stop competing. So one example is if you have plants growing in very dense growing very closely together. Plants need exposure to sunlight to have maximum photosynthesis. So if you're growing in the shade of another plant, that's competition for light. And when the plant that is shaded senses that, there is a series of chemical reactions that creates a hormone that allows it to start growing taller than the other plant. And so it grows until it's just tall enough to get the sunlight it needs for photosynthesis, and then it stops competing. And I think that that's very a thoughtful way to think about competition, because I'm not a Pollyanna that I think humans never have to compete in some capacity. But if we were simply trying to compete for our survival as opposed to hoard, as opposed to, completely destroy and obliterate the other one, I think there's a lot to learn from that.
Here's a kooky question.
I like those.
What do you think plants and trees think of people?
Okay, I'm going to tell you why I'm hesitating, or why I paused and had a deep sigh. The word think takes me to the question of whether plants have consciousness or not. And over the past 10 years, especially since Lessons from Plants came out, or articles I wrote first before the book came out, people have asked me, do I think plants have consciousness? Do I think they're sentient? And about 10 years ago, I became less interested in answering that question, yes or no, and asking myself the question, what does it mean for humans to have to say plants are sentient or they are not sentient? And I think that those who insist that they're not sentient, or those who insist that they are, I'm interested in what that tells us about them as humans. So I think more about, if I think plants think about humans, I try to live a life that they would have a positive thought about me, but I don't take a strong position on whether I think they think about us or not. But I hope that people would hope that if they did, that their life is one that the plants would say, I'm glad to share the planet with you. So during the pandemic, we had stay-at-home orders. I spent so much time in the backyard looking at trees and plants thinking, what do they think of us in this moment? And it really hit me that when you think about the relationship between humans and plants, if they disappear, we have seconds to minutes.
Mm-hmm.
If we disappear, they might have a party, just compared to how we're treating the planet, right?
They rewild things.
Yeah. But there is also a relationship between humans and plants. When you think about corn, that's domestication. And so I don't know what they think of us, but I think a lot. I want them to think well of me. And there were plants and trees in my yard that I had not paid much attention to, but the pandemic gave me an opportunity. Very early during the pandemic, I realized that stay at home couldn't mean stay at the house for me because I was going stir crazy, right? And I used to get so many of my walking steps going around campus. So I started to take a morning and evening commute. I would go and walk a mile or two before I start work and then walk. And I started to pay attention to flowers in my neighborhood and having conversations with my neighbors. So that year, some of the the leaves turned red off season. It wasn't fall yet. And one of my neighbors said, "What is going on?" And I said, "Oh, this is a stress response. If there's a severe drought, you can induce kind of this fall-like." So all of these conversations that I had just made me think about the fact that most of us will never sit with the question you ask. What do my plants know I'm here? Do I know them by name? Even if you don't know the scientific name, one of the most endearing things amongst humans is when we get to know each other well enough that we have a nickname, right? And so I have nicknames amongst my family, and that means they love me enough to give me a nickname. So if you don't know the scientific name, what do you call it? What have you observed enough about it to call it something? So I don't want people to feel like they have to go and learn all the scientific names because I have to look up some of them. I'm not a horticulturalist in that regard. But I think about that a lot. And if it's not talking to your plants, do you even notice when it puts out a new leaf? There is a serious party at my house when like my Monstera plant puts out a new leaf because you know what? It's a risk when you see it and you think, "Oh my God, I showed enough stewardship that it was safe enough for you to use energy to make a leaf as opposed to defending yourself from whatever's in my."
I have a ropoia that flowers several times a year.
That's
and
pretty impressive.
every time it puts out like a new little peduncle, I'm up there taking photos, like documenting.
And for people, I say for people who don't have like a green thumb, there are so many ways in which there are plants in our lives, whether it's plants that we get roses from a loved one or they're plants we have at funerals. Like plants are there throughout our life, from birth showers to the celebration of our memory. And yet sometimes we don't stop and think about that. And so even if you can't grow them, do you know the source of the love of all the things that are plant related in your life?
And you can tell that plants really appreciate your care and attention.
I can. They continue to grow. I was saying to you, one of my jobs, my mom had this, I forget which species it was, but it was one of these plants that grew all over her door. And when there were yellow leaves, it was our job to take them off because if you let them sit there, after a while, energy goes to that as opposed to. And so I think that they respond to your caring for them. They respond to your observing them enough that you leave them in a space where they can put most of their energy into growing as opposed to defending themselves. Because there is this thing called a growth defense kind of conundrum where plants have a certain amount of energy. And if they're spending all their energy defending against stress, they don't have energy to grow. So when you see that new leaf, it's telling you something about it being in an environment where it can put that energy into growing. And I celebrate that. That means we're in at least a neutral relationship and hopefully a positive relationship.
I have another bananas question.
Bananas. Oh, see, I thought banana. It's like, what kind of banana? You mean a bonkers banana question?
Yes,
Yes.
bonkers question. So I have heard audio
Yes.
that is supposedly plants screaming.
Yes.
So were they in fact screaming? And A, and B, do they feel pain?
If you think of us screaming as a response to pain, if you wound a plant, there is a biochemical signature that you can pick up. It's a set of chemicals. So is that a scream? It's a response. They certainly, when they are wounded, there is a response to being wounded. I actually wrote an article And I want to say, I don't know. I write a lot. Let's say it was between 2018 and 2022, but it was an article in Psyche magazine that was about how trees, it had to be after 2020 because it was about how trees heal from wounds. And I thought that there were a lot of lessons for us. I was thinking about the pandemic to learn. And the thing that I love about when you look at, I said trees, but it's true of most plants. The human condition is that if we are wounded, we want to get to healing quick. We have this fascination with just covering over the bad and let's get to healing quickly. Plants don't heal like that. And I go through this in this article that if a branch breaks off a tree, there's a wound. And the plant immediately makes chemicals that are kind of a cleansing. It keeps bacteria from getting in the wound because sugars might be released. So it keeps everything clean. And oxygen is there to clean up and kind of allow healing. It's a long time before you see it scab over. So there's a fast response to say, I have been wounded and I've got to clean this situation up. I've got to get air in here so that I can get healing. And once I'm sure that that's clean and healed, then I can kind of put the scab over the wound. And we know this also in the biomedical field. If you just have a wound and you don't clean it out, you don't allow it to have oxygen and you just cover, it's going to fester and cause more problems. As humans, we like to cover up the mess as soon as possible. We don't want to see it. And so I think plants have all of these deep lessons to kind of share with us. I don't remember how we got here, but all this idea of whether they scream, right?
Yeah.
And so I think across the biological kingdom, certainly there are responses to being hurt. And I think we have lessons to learn from the biological kingdom about we scream and then what? Right? We scream and then someone tells us, no, just try to forgive and move on. Well, I want to scream and curse and cry for a while. That's my oxygen. That's my cleansing.
And now a less bananas question.
Yes.
Just, you mentioned about, taking off the yellow leaf.
Yes.
So that, you help the plant. So there's a little bit of an intersection here with my last question, which is, whenever I do that for my plants, I feel a little bad. Like I'm clipping them and I'm like, I'm sorry. I just clipped off this piece of you. And I have to remember that I'm doing it because ultimately to help the plant, right?
Yes.
So I just want confirmation that.
Yes. Every time I do that, I said, this is for your good. You're welcome. This is all for your good, because sometimes if you don't do that, then it spreads and you lose the whole plant, right? And I think, it's so interesting that you bring that example because we talked about how I started writing lessons from plants because it was kind of a reciprocity, but also a frustration. And I think one of my biggest frustrations is that we know that kind of thing is true for plants. We really struggle with that in all the environments that I've worked, right? We struggle with clipping off the leaf, or if you have an established ecosystem, but you want to kind of introduce some diversity, sometimes older species have to be removed. And you can do that intentionally, or you see it through fire, or you see it through a natural disaster, right? The plants that are going to grow in Jamaica now after Hurricane Melissa will be different because an environment has been opened up. We struggle so much in society, in higher education, in other professional environments, when there's a yellow leaf, when there's an older tree that's dying, or it's lived its life. We struggle with that concept of saying, this is for your good, you're welcome. Because we just want to do the feel good. We just want to water. We just want to see flowers. But the entire life cycle is also removing the yellow leaf. We've just watched it with fall. The trees have to drop the leaves to get successfully, deciduous trees, to get successfully through winter. We struggle with that so much. If we figure out how not to feel bad about that, but to say, this is for your good, you're welcome, that would transform our lives.
I'm going to take that with me.
And you started off the conversation by also saying the cycle of life is such that they can become compost. Oh my gosh. Death is not the end.
Death is not the end. But, in spring, there's a lot of life and activity. In summer, there's just like full out photosynthesis. But then fall comes and they're preparing for rest. And then winter is a rest period. And we don't, as humans, we live in summer, like we just all out going all the time. And you can't do that successfully without having those periods of rest. So there are so many lessons. Every fall I usually go and do a fall colors trip and say it's time for the trees and myself to plan for rest. Because I don't want to be forced into rest by being sick or some natural disaster. So there are these kind of lessons, seasonal lessons, life lessons in terms of composting, a yellow leaf that are there if we decide, as I learned first from Robin Wall Kimmerer, that plants are wise teachers if only we're great students.
So what lesson then? I mean, how do you rest for winter?
Oh, so it depends on you, right? The things that bring you rest. And so for me, resting is walking, spending time with my son. Rest is getting near to a body of water. Rest, I need some cheaper ways of resting now that I'm thinking about it. Rest is getting a massage, right? It's all these things, but there are different things where your mind can actually stop and just focus on being. And for different people, those are different things. But I think that once you realize that what those are, planning for them is critically important. But also, the one thing that I love about plants is that they don't just act as individuals. So if one plant is attacked by insects, it will send a signal to the other trees in its community that there are insects here and they may be herbivores that are around. Prepare. And so I also stay embedded in a community that says, I haven't seen you rest lately and you look like you need it. So come to my house. I'm on the lake. And so it's this, constantly planning for your whatever it is, activity and rest. I think about self as individual and self as community. And it's only when both of those are operating that I'm at my best and able to really and truly rest.
What would you say to young people to get them thinking about, these issues that you think about and, maybe it's the science, maybe it's the ecology or anything?
I getting a chance to talk with young people is one of the most fascinating and inspiring things that I do because I think a lot about where I was as a young person. So I had decided I wanted to be a lawyer at 5 and didn't change that until the last year of undergraduate. And largely that was driven by finding a career that seemed valuable, that seemed people recognize it as something valuable to do in my community. And over time, I started to get really fascinated and curious about science. And I think it was one of the bravest things I did to say, I'm going to rescind an acceptance to law school and go figure out how to be a professional plant scientist because I have to live out my passion. And I think a lot of times, I think back to when my son was in college choosing a major, and I thought, are we asking an 18 or 19-year-old to decide what they want to do for the rest of their lives? And I think what I hope young people will do is to think about what they engage in that gives them energy, what they engage in, that they feel like they have to do more of it, and then ask how can they position their lives to do as much as that as they can, whether it's in a professional space, whether it's in an activism space. And if you can get a little bit of freedom to think about what that is that you want to do, independent of what your parents think you should do, independent of what your friends think you should do, it's about really living out your purpose. When I think about lessons from plants, one of the most powerful lessons is that plants, once they are growing, their whole purpose is to grow, to make new leaves, to make seeds, and to live out the purpose of whatever their species is. And I think that once you figure out what that is for yourself, what's the thing that you have to do? And I think we put so much pressure on them to do things that we think are valuable. And it's easy to say. When my son was telling me what he wanted to do, I said, are you sure? I don't know how you're going to make a living, right? But I also said to him, don't let that dissuade you. So when I have been most inspired when we put young people in a room and say, what are your dreams? They have dreams. Sometimes they don't know how to get to them. And that's what I think mentoring is about, not making many versions of ourselves, but saying, what can I do to use my resources, my knowledge to help you be as excited about your life as I am about mine, no matter what that looks like.
We have to honor our natures as much as we have to respect different needs of plants.
Absolutely. And I think that that's one of the things we struggle with, right? Yeah. When you come up with these lessons, you predict which one you think is going to be most impactful, and I got it wrong. The two that have been most impactful, one of them is this idea that if you have two identical plants, you can get completely different outcomes because of the external environment. And when we see that with youth or our colleagues, we usually assume it's something going on with them. But in nature, we know that the aptitude is activated by the external environment. So if we paid attention to that and had stewardship over that, we might activate their most productivity as opposed to saying to them, no, you have to do this. The other one is this idea of pioneers and the power of being a pioneer plant for transforming an environment, even if it's a very short life. And I think those are lessons that young people really need. And one of the most important things I got to do at Michigan State University before I left was to teach lessons of plants to first-year students. Not the mentors about what they should do, but for them to understand that if you're thriving or struggling, it might be your external environment. Don't assume that it's you.
How was that lesson received?
It was so amazing because there were some students who I think had been shrouded in imposter syndrome because they were struggling with the transition to university in their first year. And because of the way society's set up, they immediately assume I don't have what it takes. And I said, what if you're not in the right environment? What if it's the class you're in that's the problem? What if it's the professor you have that's the problem? Don't immediately assume. Ask the university, have you put me in the right environment? Have you given me all the resources that I need? And, the example I use is that if you have a plant that is wilting because it needs water, it's not going to be surviving until it gets water transferred. You can say, okay, go over there to the water center. We tell them, go to the writing center. What if they don't know how to walk in and they don't know what to ask for? So I think many of them felt empowered that if they were struggling, they had agency to ask, maybe I'm perfectly capable of this and it's the external environment. So I think that, imposter syndrome certainly can be real, but sometimes it's imposed on you because people keep saying you should be transitioning better. You should be picking this up quicker. And the question is, have you given me the right environment to do that? And so that was really powerful because I saw some students really able to ask some questions that reposition their expectations and allow them to thrive. And the greatest joy I had, one of my very first undergrads in my lab, before I left Michigan State, came back as a tenure-track professor in my same department. And she talked about how the mentoring she received as an undergrad transformed her, but also now how she wanted to set up her environment to be a steward and not a reproducer of herself, right?
We each have to discover who we are.
Absolutely.
And
what we need.
ask for what we need.
Yeah.
As much as, plants that are crowded or
That's right.
dropping all their leaves are telling us what they
That's
need.
right. That's right. And we have to recognize the signs for ourselves or for each other in community, because sometimes you don't recognize them for yourself. But if you know someone well enough, you can say, Ivelisse, you don't seem to be responding well. I don't know what's going on. Have you been to Zumba lately? And so it goes back to this self and community, right? And so I think it's critically important. Yeah.
That concludes today's program.
BornCurious is brought to you by Harvard Radcliffe Institute. Our producer is Alan Grazioso. Anna Song and Cabin 3 Media provided editing and production support. Many thanks to Jane Huber for editorial support. And we are your co-hosts. I'm Ivelisse Estrada.
And I'm Heather Min.
Our website, where you can listen to all our episodes, is radcliffe.harvard.edu/BornCurious.
If you have feedback, you can email us at info@radcliffe.harvard.edu.
You can follow Harvard Radcliffe Institute on Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Threads. And as always, you can find BornCurious wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for learning with us.
And join us next time.